So, what did we learn this season? Let's find out. Welcome into Fantasy Baseball today on Tuesday, October 7th. I am Frank Stampfl, joined by Scott White and Chris Towers. Today on the show, we will reveal our biggest lessons learned. But first, I want to talk about two young pitchers who dominated in their lone starts here in the playoffs. Chris, I know you're a big fan of the movie A Star is Born. We might have two stars on our hands here. Trey Yesavage and Cam Schlittler. Let's start with Trey Yesavage here, who just mowed down the Yankees in Game 2 of the ALDS.
Oh, yeah!
Got to get that in. Big part of that. 5 1/3 no-hit innings, 1 walk, 11 strikeouts here for Yesavage. Had 18 whiffs on 78 pitches, 11 on the splitter, 5 on the slider, 2 on the fastball, 45% CSW, only 78 pitches. Honestly, this start could have been even better. That splitter was just absolutely disgusting. We now have a 4-start sample, which is still very, very small. I realize that, but 3 of the 4 starts have looked great. Trey Yesavage started the season. He's only 22 years old, by the way. Started the season in A-ball, pitched 4 different levels, and now finds himself destroying the Yankees in the playoffs. So this is the type of performance, especially if he builds off this and has multiple starts that are very good, that can hike up an ADP for next season. What do you guys think about Trey Yesavage?
I saw a tweet that was like, it was something like, here's a partial list of the teams that Trey Yesavage has wins against this year. Pensacola Blue Wahoos, Hartford Yard Goats, New York Yankees in the playoffs. Yeah. It's pretty good. It's pretty good.
I would say Trey Yesavage is everything that I hyped Jonah Tong to be. And that I hyped Jonah Tong to be a lot, you know, and it's kind of fitting to make that comparison for a couple of reasons. One is both of their arm angle is like 63, 64 degrees, which is extremely high, and it makes an unusual look. The difference is Jonah Tong, I'm sorry, Trey Yesavage has at least one killer secondary in that splitter. And Jonah Tong, it's not clear that he does. And so that's why we're seeing Trey Yesavage carry over his terrific minor league strikeout rates to the majors. And he actually, even ahead of Tong, Trey Yesavage led all upper level minor leaguers in strikeouts per 9 innings. Both of them were over 14, but Yesavage was a little higher. And like I said, we're seeing it carry over because that splitter is just so filthy, particularly coming at it from such a high arm angle. So there are going to be control issues. We saw it pop up in his second major league start. There are going to be build-up issues in terms of taking on a bigger workload. That's something that's a big hurdle every young pitcher has to clear. But we didn't see Yesavage work particularly deep into games in the minors this year. So that's probably the biggest issue for him moving forward, evaluating him for 2026.
He averaged right around 4 innings per start.
Yeah, and he was throwing the no-hitter in this playoff game, and they still pulled him after 5 1/3 innings. Mm-hmm. So, and actually the Yankees mounted. Probably wasn't that serious of a comeback, but they scored a lot of runs off the Blue Jays bullpen once Yesavage came out. So those are big hurdles. That's part of the reason why, relative to the hype, his fantasy value may be suppressed. But I've been impressed with Trey Yesavage and think however long it takes him to clear that hurdle of providing length, he'll be really good.
Yes. So far he has thrown a combined 117 1/3 innings. That's across the minors, the majors where he made 3 starts at the end of the regular season, and then his lone start here in the playoffs. And I guess anything can happen, but it looks like the Blue Jays are going to move on, and he'll make a couple more starts at least. I would think there. So
don't count your Yankees out just yet.
Right?
Don't count them out.
So,
but basically the point I was going to get at is if he throws around 120 this season, I think we can kind of, barring injury, expect like 150 for next year from Trey Yesavage.
So here's a question. Who would you rather have for 2026? Trey Yesavage, or he just got pulled from the game, but Jacob Misiorowski, we were all just watching before we went live. Misiorowski obviously had a ton of hype when he got up to the majors, was ranked a little higher than Yesavage at the beginning and midpoints of this season, but obviously I think faded a bit after he came back from that shin injury. And, for all the crazy stuff that Misiorowski has, the 104-mile-an-hour fastball or whatever, I think Yesavage had a higher strikeout rate than him in the minors. Yeah, significantly. It was like 41% for Yesavage to 31% for Misiorowski.
I think it's easily Yesavage because I think Yesavage's biggest issue with working deep into games, Misiorowski shares it. 5 of his final 8 appearances were less than 5 innings, and he had a 6.06 ERA in them.
Yeah.
His control issues are even more pronounced than Yesavage's, and it's sort of like Jonah Tong. It's not clear Misiorowski has a great secondary option. So the fastball is great, and look, I think there's a lot of upside there, but I think Yesavage is just all he really needs to accomplish is just the typically built up process that every young pitcher has to accomplish, which isn't a given, but it's typical. Misiorowski has more hurdles to clear than that.
Ultimately, when it comes to Tong and Misiorowski, Yesavage, Schlittler, I think McLean is probably going to be well ahead of those guys. Schlittler might actually be as well. Sproat, who are some of the other young guys that got called up at the end of the year? I'm sure there were a couple other that I'm forgetting. It seemed like we had a ton of huge call-ups at the end of the season.
Those were probably
Peyton Tolley, Connolly Early.
Yep. Parker Messick, but that's
Parker Messick.
You're getting lower end.
Luis Morales.
Luis Morales.
Bubba Chandler.
I think ultimately, I'm not going to say I'm going to be out on whoever's most expensive because I think you do need to have some exposure to these talented young arms. But with all of those guys, and there's so many of them, we just named 10 of them. I probably want like 3 of them on my rosters next season. And so it might be one of the earlier guys, which I would guess will be Burns belongs in that discussion. And Burns might be my favorite of this group. I know it's been a while, but remember 4 straight starts, I believe, with 10 strikeouts. Not a lot of guys at any level of baseball do that.
My favorite stat here, as far as that goes, Chris, is Chase Burns was up for 8. Was it 8 appearances or 8 starts? Well, I think it was 8. It was 8. He appeared 8 times, 4 of them double-digit strikeouts. That is more than Paul Skeens, more double-digit strikeout games than Paul Skeens has had in his entire career.
Yeah, that's and also part of that is just Burns was among this group the best coming into the season. I don't think he did anything. The best prospect coming into the season. I don't think he did anything to lose that stature. So among that group, if Burns isn't the most expensive, great. I'll just take Chase Burns a lot. But what I'll probably do is mix in one of the earlier round guys, which I think will be Yesavage, Burns, McLean, Misiorowski. Those guys will probably all go top 150. Probably not top 100, but probably top 150, I would guess, for all of them.
Might get close. To top 100.
Mid-top 120.
Yep.
Take one of them, maybe 2, and then get a couple bites at the apple with Connolly Early, who I think looked really good, and Parker Messick, and Luis Morales, who came on really strong at the end of the season. That's probably the way I'll approach it. But a lot of interesting young pitchers heading into 2026. I'm still not used to saying 2026. I've typed it probably 80 times in the past month and a half, and I'm still 2025 is next year, right? There's no way 2026 is next year. I'll get there in some point in the next 2 months, I guess.
Let's quickly just run through what Cam Schlittler did if we travel way back in time to last Thursday in a decisive Game 3 in the wildcard round against the Red Sox. Schlittler threw 8 shutout innings with 12 strikeouts to 0 walks. He had 18 whiffs on 107 pitches, 11 of those on the fastball, 5 on the sinker. The first pitcher to go 8 scoreless innings with 12 strikeouts and 0 walks in MLB postseason history. That seems impossible. There have been so many postseason games, but Cam Schlittler stands alone. It was really just the fastball and sinker, man. They accounted for 70% of his pitches. I still have questions about the secondaries, but if the fastball is this good, maybe it doesn't matter. I don't know, but go for it.
So Cam Schlittler has cleared the hurdle. of pitching deep into games. He went 8 innings in this playoff start, struck out 12. His final regular season start, remember, 2 hits and 7 shutout innings with 9 strikeouts.
I'm going to be honest, did not remember that.
And then he had, 4 of his, so counting that 7 inning start at the end of the season, 5 of his final 8 starts.
Yeah, and six of his last 10 went 6+. Yeah.
Okay,
And
so
90 pitches or more in 9 starts total, including the postseason. 89 or more in 11 of 15.
And he had more than a strikeout per inning each of those times he went 6 or more. More than a strikeout per inning. Usually it looks like 2 or more strikeouts than innings. So Cam Schlittler was actually providing the length you'd expect of a frontline major league pitcher, which is very impressive for somebody who was called up in the middle of the year, like a rookie and not even a rookie for the full season. Very impressive. He's already cleared that hurdle. And in some ways, I don't want to overthink it. Like he is giving you the volume you want. He's dominant with it. Don't overthink it. But same as you, Frank, I look at the actual breakdown of the pitches and I'm like, okay, it's a good fastball. It's uncommon to see a fastball have the highest whiff rate of any of a pitcher's pitches. And it's a great whiff rate for a fastball, but you want there to sort of like Spencer Strider when he had a great fastball, he had this slider that
50% whiff rate. Yeah.
Right.
I think the biggest
whiff rate
thing
on the slider was like 20 percentage points higher than the fastball, as good as the fastball was. And so what happens if Cam Schlittler, if he's throwing 97 instead of 98? Mm-hmm. How
which is what he was throwing in AAA. Okay. He averaged 95 miles per hour last year, 96.6 at AAA before his promotion this year, 98 at the major league level. That is also just I don't know how much to put on that, but that kind of velocity jump is worrisome. Even for he's massive, right? He's 6'8", something like that.
He's 5'6", but yeah, he's big.
So there's I guess something, but that kind of gigantic velocity jump in a very short amount of time. Maybe he was just holding back. Maybe he was always capable of sitting 98, but
yeah.
I'm a little worried. And I think just in general, you'd like to see one pitch with a whiff rate over 30%. That's not to say he can't be good without it, but, even the fastball, 28% whiff rate's really good, but that's not like Luis Castillo was at 33% a couple years ago. That's a very, very good mark, but it's not necessarily tippy top of the league as well. So I think there are a few concerns here with Cam Schlittler, but on the whole, I think he's got to be in that first tier of the second year pitchers, or I guess some of them will be rookies.
I think he's probably, except for maybe Chase Burns, I think Cam Schlittler's probably earned the right to be drafted tops among them.
You'd put him ahead of Nolan McLean?
I think so. I mean, as good as these last 2 starts were, and there is a flag there, a potential red flag there with, is the secondary arsenal good enough? But I want to stress, and this will kind of play into one of my lessons learned that we'll get to later. That shouldn't be a deal breaker. Because, I mean, teams are, I don't know if we should credit the teams. I don't know. But just the way the league is trending, pitchers tweaking their arsenals, adding pitches, subtracting pitches very easily. And so it wouldn't take much for him to come up with one secondary pitch that will put less pressure on his fastball to be as good as it's been. And I would bet on him doing that. So I guess I'd just say when you're approaching Cam Schlittler for 2026, I would not approach him saying, look how good he was as a rookie. Imagine how much better he could be.
Sure, yeah.
I would say, look how good he was as a rookie. Hopefully he'll be 85, 90% of that.
All right, some other quick playoff updates here. Since we last spoke, the Padres, Reds, Guardians, and Red Sox were all eliminated in the wild card round. As mentioned, the Blue Jays are currently whooping my Yanks 2-0. The Dodgers lead the Phillies 2-0 as well. Roki Sasaki picking up saves in each of those wins. He's also closed out 3 different games in the playoffs, and he's looked ridiculous out of the bullpen. So it will be interesting to see how this influences next season. Is this something that Roki Sasaki can carry over into next year as a starter, or is he so good in the playoffs as a reliever that they just use him as their closer next year?
There was a piece on ESPN.com on Monday, I believe, about how they rebuilt him, and goes really in depth in their process. A really good article. You should read it.
Jeff Passan.
But yeah, they found some mechanical things. There was some. I'm not a
It had to do
kinesiologist or whatever, so I don't really understand. But like, it was something about the way his pelvis was dipping during his delivery, and they got him to stay back a little more. And like immediately, his next start, his velocity was up like 4 miles per hour. But it doesn't. Nothing in that article sounded like they don't think he's going to be a starter moving forward. Everything sounded like he's going to be a starter, or at least he's going to get that chance.
I was looking for that. That is the main thing I wanted to know as somebody who writes about fantasy baseball, and I didn't see an indication one way or another.
Okay.
It gives me a little more hope that since they tied it to a mechanical issue, that it's not just, okay, he picked up more velocity because he's throwing shorter spurts, and so he's airing it out more. You know, like there was an actual mechanical thing they fixed there that improved the velocity, and that I think at least opens the door to try him out as a starter. But they invested a lot in their bullpen this offseason and came away with no closer out of it. And like, if he, especially since they have a ton of starting pitcher depth, if he just becomes this lockdown 9th inning guy, and they were able to salvage his rookie season that way, I could see them saying like that's enough of a win for us given our abundance of pitching riches. I'm not ruling that out. I don't know. I'm just speculating because we don't have any kind of official statement on it.
So I guess what I saw was this was Passan saying, even if Sasaki will transition back to starting pitching next year, he's a reliever this month. That I guess that's the only thing that's really in there. So I was
trying to interpret what that meant. Frank and I were talking about it when you weren't on. I'm like, does he mean even if as in even though? Yeah. Because even though is more definitive. Even if is, I don't know, but it's possible this could happen. Yeah.
So it's Snell, Yamamoto, Glasnow, Ohtani. Emmett Sheehan. I think he's earned that right to be in the rotation next year, right? He's got to.
He deserves it.
Kershaw's retiring, so he's out of the picture.
And they'll probably go 6-man a lot too.
Yeah, I would think it's going to be 6-man by default. They have the flexibility with Ohtani. They got that extra the extra pitcher spot on their roster. It's not an extra roster spot, but they get an extra pitcher. Gonsolin is probably out until late summer. Gavin Stone, who knows? I don't think you can bet on him. Yeah, I think he's going to be in the rotation unless they have more faith in Bobby Miller than they've given any reason to believe,
or they bring in one of the big guys.
Yeah, I guess there's always that.
I was just going to say, what if they sign Dylan Cease or something?
And they've got prospects, right? Like Jackson Ferris is a decent prospect. They've got a couple other guys, right? They always do.
We'll see.
Freaking Dodgers.
I would agree that it seems like it's leaning that way. 6-man with both Emmett Sheehan and Sasaki probably in there to start next season. The Mariners-Tigers are tied up 1-1 in that series. Jorge Polanco took Tarek Skubal deep twice in Game 2. The Brewers are up 1-0 at the time of recording this, though they're kind of pulling away with Game 2, so it looks like it's going to be a 2-game lead there for the Brewers as well. Big thanks to those watching live. Make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more fantasy baseball content all off season long. Let's take a break. We'll be back right after this.
You can always count on Sundays with the NFL on CBS and Paramount Plus. So even if you can't count on accurate expiration dates,
that is a rookie mistake,
or people appreciating your fashion sense,
Jim, the crowd is not on board here.
You can always count on Sundays with the NFL on CBS, streaming on Paramount+.
Glad we wear our good jerseys.
Yeah.
Welcome back in Fantasy Baseball today. Quickly run through some news and notes before we get to our lessons learned. Jackson Chourio left game 1 of the NLDS with right hamstring tightness, the same hamstring he hurt earlier this season, but was back in the lineup for game 2 and hit a 3-run homer. So I think he's fine. Lawrence Butler underwent surgery Friday to repair a tear in his right patellar tendon. Apparently he played through knee issues down the stretch, expected to be ready for spring training. Wonder how long this season he was dealing with that. Perhaps it
was both knees too. He didn't have surgery in both knees, but he had like an injection in the other knee as well. So if you're looking for a reason to explain,
he still ran quite a bit this year too.
Yeah, I think his sprint speed was down, but he still ended up with 20/20, I believe. If you're looking for a reason to be optimistic about Lawrence Butler at a massively reduced price for 2026, that's as good a reason as you'll find. I'm not sure that's why he can't hit lefties, but I'm willing to, even if it's just a repeat of 2025 and he doesn't get any better, he's not going to be a top 100 pick this time. So I think he'll be a decent target in 2026 drafts.
Lawrence Butler, 21 homers, 22 steals, but that came with a .234 batting average this past season. Rays president Eric Neander said he expects Shane McClanahan to be fully ready for the start of spring training. McClanahan made just 2 rehab starts in the minors this year due to a nerve issue in his left triceps, which he eventually had surgery on in August. McClanahan is now 28 years old. He has not made a regular season start since August of 2023. So I have no idea what to expect. In fact, I think you should have 0 expectations and kind of go from there.
I feel like we're in Walker Buehler territory with Shane McClanahan. There's another two Tommy John surgery guy. It was a difficult recovery. The start he did make, or the 2 1/3 innings he threw at AAA, his fastball velocity was 93 miles per hour. It was down 4 miles per hour from the last time we saw him. This is like, if you want to throw him on in a reserve round pick, that maybe that's okay. But I
So
can't
you're not
justify
saying Walker Buehler immediately coming back from his second Tommy John.
Oh, no. I'm saying,
you're saying Walker Buehler right now is how
I kind of view Shane McClanahan where Walker Buehler was at the start of 2025, where like, hey, maybe you bet on something, but I don't think there's like, Buehler had to have been.
He was outside
250.
He was outside.
I'm not trying to be like, I don't know what the word is. I'm not trying to like get you in a gotcha here. Get you in a gotcha.
Yeah, look, I just.
So he was the 68th starting pitcher drafted this year, Buehler.
That's probably
that
is cheap enough where it doesn't really matter. Like if you want to say 61st and someone else wants to say 81st, whatever, there's functionally no difference there. But it's just to say that I think you, like Frank said, you can't expect anything from him.
Red Sox chief baseball officer Craig Breslow would not commit to Tristan Casas being the team's starting first baseman next season. Casas had left knee surgery in May. In fact, it's not even a guarantee that he'll be ready for opening day.
Ooh,
so we shall see.
I did not have him in my top 20 first baseman for next year. Yeah. And that seems right with this news coming out.
I'm hoping there's a change of scenery.
Yeah, we'll see. Chris, good news for your Scott White Dynasty League team. Reed Detmers will enter next season as a starter with the Angels. Still just 26 years old. He pitched well as a reliever this year. 3.96 ERA, 130 WHIP, 11 K per 9. The underlying numbers actually liked him even more. So we'll see if any of that success can translate back into being a starter. Speaking of the Angels, their first-round pick, starting pitcher Tyler Bremner is dealing with elbow soreness. So keep that in mind for Dynasty Leagues, those doing first-year player drafts. Red Sox catcher Carlos Narvaez will undergo arthroscopic surgery this week to repair the meniscus in his left knee. He's expected to be ready for spring training. We had a bunch of Rangers updates. First off, they hired Skip Schumacher as their new manager. He won NL Manager of the Year with the Marlins back in 2023. Nathan Eovaldi might need sports hernia surgery. His season actually ended with a rotator cuff strain back in August. Jake Berger is expected to require 6 to 8 weeks to recover from wrist surgery. And Cody Bradford, who had internal brace surgery in June, is expected to be a full participant during spring training. seems kind of aggressive to me, but what do I know? I have not been able to diagnose or time these things out very well. So I'm sure the Rangers know more than I do.
The Jake Berger one is just, I'm working on like my state of the first base position for the newsletter this week. Looking at like previewing the offseason, reviewing where we stand. And
I read your catcher one, by the way. It was really good. I liked
oh,
it.
Thank you. I'm capable of writing one good thing a year. That's the one. No, I knew we had drafted Jake Berger way too high this year. He was like 105 in ADP this year. That was bad. That was not good. That was a mistake on us. I
was looking through all of our sleepers, breakouts, and bust articles. That's a podcast we'll do later this week, kind of reviewing all those picks and stuff. I had Jake Berger as a bust and didn't draft him anywhere, but I was kind of scared about it because everybody else was getting excited about Jake Berger.
That's, we're going to talk about some lessons. Here's a lesson. When the guy you're drafting only does 30 good things a year at best, and that is all he's capable of, and he's playing for a team that has depth and wants to win games, that's probably a bad pick at 100 overall.
You guys made that exact argument early in the offseason last year, and I was the only one that stuck with it. And I think after he got traded to the Rangers, you guys were like, but he's.
I think I kind of backed off of him as a bust, right? Yeah.
Well, Chris definitely did. And look, I wasn't. I liked him when he was around pick 130. If he got up to pick 105,
he just kept going up.
I don't think I ended up drafting Berger anywhere. But I liked it in theory. He only hit 16 home runs.
Yeah,
he didn't hit 32.
A lot of time. Yeah.
So that's.
And that's the thing.
I have him 27th at first base for next year, so it's not like I'm expecting a bounce back, but it is possible. And
as a late round,
you'll like the price for him next year a lot more than this year.
As a late round corner infielder for power, I think he's an okay bet in 2026. But that was just, I had forgotten how high the price had gotten on him, and that's one where it's just, we usually don't care about like bad base runner, bad defense, doesn't draw walks, doesn't get on base, but like. For the Rangers, that mattered, and he lost a lot of playing time because of it.
Yep. And perhaps the biggest news item of all, Scott White has paid off the cereal bet. That's right. Oh, wait. I got to turn this thing around. What do we get here? Apple Pie Toast Crunch. So I did want to go with some kind of weird limited edition cereal. And
those are always great.
This is what we landed on. Is that sarcasm I'm sensing from you?
That is.
Yes.
If it was really that good, they'd just sell it year round.
You know what? I will say.
They just made it, Scott. And you know what?
That's not always true. Taco Bell has some bangers that they just take off the menu every 4 months.
It's pretty good so far. It's like Cinnamon Toast Crunch and Apple Jacks had a baby. And this is what came out.
Man, Apple Jacks. I haven't had an Apple Jack in
not a big
20
Apple Jacks
years.
guy. Yeah.
It's unique. I'm not going to say it's the best cereal I ever had. It's not the worst cereal I ever had.
So that means it doesn't actually taste like apples, if you're saying. That was the whole pitch. That was the whole holder. That was the whole like commercial I can't think of words, but that was what they said in every commercial. It doesn't taste like apples, and the kids said they liked it anyway. So, that was the story for Apple Jacks.
All right, here we are halfway through the podcast. Let's finally talk about lessons learned this season, and we will start with Scott. What do we have here?
All right, my first lesson learned is not so much like I made a mistake thing, but pull air rate is the missing link to understanding hitter performance. This was a game changer this year. I feel like I don't know if StatCast always had it on their page, or if they
I think it was a new addition this year.
Yeah, okay,
maybe second half last year.
Because I only noticed it this year, and it explains so much. All those times that we looked at a hitter's exit velocities, we looked at his expected stats even, and we were like, wow, why is this guy not performing as well as his expected stats say we should? And from reviewing it so many times over the course of the year, the answer was most often the pull air rate wasn't good enough. And conversely, when a guy was consistently overperforming his expected stats, it was because his pull air rate was great. Now, there are examples where this doesn't line up completely. So I'm not saying I'm not saying we've totally cracked the nut here as far as evaluating hitter performance goes, but I think this is a huge leap forward. And like I knew it was a factor, but before StatCast made this one singular stat, pull air rate, the way I had to go figure out if a player was pulling the ball in the air a lot was a multi-step process on Fangraphs that, frankly, you just couldn't look up for every player. Certainly not over the course of the season. I mean, every day when we're coming on this podcast, I'm reviewing 40 plus players every night. And if I have to take this multi-step process to look up pull air rate for any of these players consistent, like there just wasn't enough time to do it. But with this singular stat on a StatCast page, a page I'm visiting every time I look up a player anyway, like it's easier to understand, and it's a lot more accessible the way they present it. And so, for instance, a guy like Ben Rice, who underperformed his expected stats by quite a lot, had a great year, but was one of the biggest underachievers by the expected stats anyway. It's like, okay, well, is he one of these guys who's just going to continually underperform his expected stats? You look at his pull air rate, it's great. And so I think Ben Rice is he might be my favorite hitter for next year, frankly, because I feel like for as good as he was, there's so much more on the table because everything looks great for him. Expected stats, pull air rate, the park he's playing in half the time for a left-handed hitter. It's just a question if he's going to be an everyday player in my mind. So, that's one example, but like it was a huge leap forward in terms of me evaluating hitters, and it simplified the process so much by just having that one singular number to size up how well a player pulls the ball in the air, that it's almost too easy, that my analysis almost becomes, look at his pull air rate. And like, that's what good am I if all I'm doing is pointing to this number on a player's StatCast page? But it's a great number.
I was going to point out, Scott, that people might not be surprised to hear that was your number one lesson, because I feel like you did bring up pull air rate quite a bit this past season. And again, it was the first time that it was really accessible for all of us. So for anybody listening or watching, if you want to find this stat and other great StatCast numbers, go to baseballsavant.com. You could type in a player's name in the search bar in the top right corner, and then you just scroll down to their batted ball profile, and you'll see pulled air percentage. If it's blue, it's not a good pull air percentage. If it's red, obviously that person does that quite a bit. So you can look that up yourself as well. Chris, let's go over to you for a lesson you learned this season.
So one thing I wanted to do was, I feel like I spent a lot of time this season struggling with pitchers who were overperforming, or like my own pitching staffs. We talked about, the leagues where I struggled, and it was mostly pitching. So I wanted to dive into, is there something systemic that I'm missing or that I'm doing wrong? And when I looked into it, I didn't really see any real explanation beyond I picked the wrong pitchers in specific tiers. And so my first lesson that I want to talk about is, this is annoying, but not everything that happens is a lesson. Because I wanted to really look at, hey, is there something about these advanced stats for pitchers that's leading us astray, that's not working anymore? Well, not really, no. There were 2 qualifiers who outperformed their FIP by 1 run, and 12 who outperformed their FIP by 0.5 runs this season. I used FIP just because that's the easiest one, but the results for xERA looked very similar. Last year, there were 2 and 10, so basically the same. 2023, 1 outperformed by 1 run, 9 outperformed by half a run. 2022, 2 and 13, basically the same. 2021, 0 and 7, but there were only 39 qualifying pitchers last year, or that year. I don't really think we can learn anything from 2021, but the point is, there was not some systemic failure across the board for the pitchers who overperformed or underperformed. Now then, I wanted to say, well, what about the ones who did overperform? Was there something that they shared that could lead to this, that we can learn, No. The 2 biggest overperformers by FIP this year were Gavin Williams and Zach Littell. I don't know if you could find two less similar pitchers in baseball in terms of their approach and their skill sets than Zach Littell and Gavin Williams. There were a few control specialists among that 0.5 ERA guys, Brian Wu, Zach Littell, Jacob deGrom, if you want to count him. He had like a 5.5% walk rate this year. Some high strikeout guys, Hunter Brown, Freddie Peralta, extreme ground ballers, extreme fly ballers. Like, I just don't think there's any there in that. And so that's the one thing that, like, my pitching staffs were so bad this year that there's a part of me that's like, I got to rethink this. And maybe we'll get to a later point in the offseason, but that's the first thing I want to take is maybe it's just don't overlearn a lesson or don't try to overfit. Don't look at the results and say there has to be something there, because I'm not trying to give myself excuses. I had a bad year in terms of the pitchers I pitched, and some of that will come in my later lessons, but I did want to start there if just the process still seems fine. There is not something broken about the ways we evaluate pitchers. There will be stretches every year where some, like a 90th percentile outcome, like an outcome where a guy beats 90% of their projections, you should expect that to happen roughly 10% of the time. And when there are 150 pitchers pitching as starting pitchers in the majors at any given time, do the math. You would expect 15 of them to be in a 90th percentile outcome at any given time. Mm-hmm. It's, again, I don't want it to sound like I'm making excuses or giving myself room to slither out of, anything, but it's just,
no,
I wanted to look for a lesson, and I'm trying to remind myself that,
well,
just because you got something wrong, or just because something went wrong, or just because something, that doesn't necessarily mean there's a lesson to draw from that. And I don't want to learn the wrong lesson at the start.
Yeah, no, of course. And I think that's, I think it's, you don't want to overcorrect. Like, an overcorrection is worse. An overcorrection is worse than an undercorrection. If particularly if it's something that you already are very capable at.
Yeah.
So I'm with you there. What you're mostly speaking to is the way you evaluate starting pitchers. And just intuitively, without having looked into the numbers you've looked at, I would agree that the process is good there. I wonder if your approach to drafting pitchers, like, did you look much into that? And I'm not saying it's wrong.
That might be the next thing I have to look into. Yeah.
But that is a separate variable than like, you may have the right evaluations and just not structure your pitching staff in a way that can withstand some of the variance that tends to happen at that position, especially.
Yeah, and part of that is getting into my second lesson, which we can talk a little bit more about later. But, like, I was really heavy on George Kirby and Grayson Rodriguez this year before their injuries. I had 0 Garrett Crochet, 0 Jacob deGrom, and 0, who was the other one? Jordan Yamamoto. I had 0 of them, just injury workload concerns, and that's kind of the whole ball game, right? Like, if you bet on aces and you didn't have any exposure to Grom, Crochet, and Yamamoto, and I don't think I drafted Skeens either. It's like, yeah, that's kind of the whole ball game right there. Those were like 4 of the, 7 best pitchers in baseball that I just didn't have any exposure to.
Chris, I don't know if you realize this, but you just had a Marlins Freudian slip. You said Jordan Yamamoto.
Wow.
Instead of Yoshinobu Yamamoto.
That's
who? Jordan Yamamoto.
Yeah,
that guy pitched for the Marlins.
There's about 3 people listening who know who
great minor league numbers. Really, really good minor league numbers for that guy.
I do want to keep this discussion going on pitching. Let's take a quick break. When we return, one of my lessons here is that figuring out pitching is hard, or maybe I just didn't do it right this past season. So let's take a little bit more of a look into that right after this.
Only CBS Sports can bring you big time during the heart of Saturday afternoons. It's big time.
It's big time. It's big time. It's big time.
On CBS and streaming on Paramount Plus.
Welcome back in Fantasy Baseball today. So we left off talking about pitching and trying to figure out what lessons we can take from that this season. And I feel like all of us we all kind of had a similar mindset, I think. I don't want to speak for everybody, but of waiting on pitching a little bit more coming into this season. And I thought that I could pull that off because there were guys in rounds 4 through 6 that I would be okay with as my SP1, SP2, and just kind of loading up on a bunch of those names. And pitching was a problem for me just across the board this year. I waited on pitching a lot. I wound up with a lot of Framber Valdez or Dylan Cease as my ace on many teams. In hindsight, like Valdez feels better as an SP2, I think, in fantasy. I think we can kind of make that, determination at this point. Chris, you're spot on with Cease. It's, fade him when you have to pay up for him, target him when he's coming off a bad season. I also, and don't want to make excuses, I had bad luck with injuries. I had Corbin Burns, Cole Reagan, Spencer Schwellenbach, and Justin Steele on multiple teams. All those guys missed extended time this season. And my ratios were bad in a lot of leagues. I had 2 different roto leagues where I was first in wins and strikeouts and towards the bottom in ERA and WHIP. So I'm trying to figure out, was it something that I did? I think in previous years, I typically get an SP in rounds 2 or 3 as my SP1, and then maybe dive back in rounds 4, 5, or 6 as my SP2. And I don't think that that's like a foolproof process per se, but I think me waiting a little bit more on pitching obviously affected this a lot. I also think that I need to be more open to drafting pitchers who I have quote unquote workload or injury concerns about, because I look back at my lessons learned last season, the rundown for this podcast last year, and that was one of my lessons is don't be scared of pitchers who have injury concerns or workload limits. And look at a lot of pitchers that worked out this year. Crochet, Brian Wu, Yoshinobu Yamamoto, Max Fried, DeGrom, Sale, Hunter Green.
Well, I don't think Hunter Green worked out.
Well, they were both great on a per.
They were. Blake Snell was great. Blake Snell was great.
Were definitely great.
But Blake Snell was great on a per inning basis, but he threw 55 innings, something like that. Spencer Schwellenbach, that didn't work out. Michael King coming off his one high inning season, ultimately, unfortunately, the answer to a lot of these questions is just draft the best players. Just draft the guys who have good seasons. And
that's what I think Frank is saying. I mean, because yes, some of the ones who we were worried about their workload coming in still fell short in terms of workload, but Frank is saying many did not. And meanwhile, guys that we thought were safe for workload, Zach Wheeler immediately comes to mind. George Kirby, sure.
Logan Gilbert.
Yeah, Logan Gilbert missed some
time. If you drafted early enough, Garrett Cole, if you drafted Corbin Burns, who was like the safest ace.
Yeah, so
Logan
it's more.
Logan Gilbert was a big innings guy coming into this year.
It's not something we can predict very well, which we're not the first to say. I mean, I've referenced Nick Pollock's approach to pitching. Drafting pitching in fantasy, which is just ignore that entirely and totally focus on how capable the pitcher is, just how dominant he is. I don't think I'd go that far, but I have, particularly in the last couple of years, I have trended more toward that side of things. I know I was the highest on Blake Snell coming in. Okay, Blake Snell still ended up not throwing a lot of innings, but I was the highest on Crochet, I think, of the three of us coming in too, for the same reason. And it's just not something I'm going to stress about as much. Also, approach I took this year with Roto League specifically, because that seemed to be mainly what you were referencing, Frank, draft for whip above anything else. I had been drafting for strikeouts above anything else.
Think about a lot of those guys, though, right? Like Bryce Miller, Bailey Ober, Imanaga. I guess Imanaga's whip was still good, but
those three particular were kind of because I wrote about that trio together a lot of times because they all had this one major risk factor in terms of serving up home runs. And so they might be good at whip, but there's a good chance they'd be worse at ERA than you were drafting them to be. And in the case of, two especially, but to some degree, all three, Imanaga's ERA ended up close to 4. And Imanaga still ended up being great at whip. The other two, I think, were pretty bad.
We're just bad at everything,
in general.
Yeah. But there were injuries with all three of them that make it hard to know. Yeah.
I guess what I'm saying is, yes, anything you do, there are going to be instances of it going wrong. I mean, it's pitching, of course. It's extremely volatile. But if you're consistently drafting for WHIP, you probably don't have to worry about ERA either. And you probably don't have to stress about strikeouts so much, because that's part of the reason why they end up with a low WHIP. And like, you should pay attention to all of these things. I'm not saying just focus on one category, but if you're drafting for WHIP, you're less likely to have these unexpected ratio problems that are harder to fix in a roto league. The other thing I wanted to say relevant to your lesson learned is that I don't think we all three took the same approach to pitching. I know, for instance, Chris was more about drafting a really high-end ace. I don't remember where you were, Frank, but I was more about like really hitting the second and third tier heavily and getting a lot of those guys.
Yeah, I know. Typically, Chris, it feels like you would try to get that like that one.
He would try to get an ace and then wait a little longer, kind of wait past the second and third tier to start grabbing pitchers, right?
So
the aces for the most part worked out. Burns being the big example, and I had a lot of Corbin Burns, unfortunately.
Yeah.
If you had a lot of Scoople, that would have gone great.
So that's why I don't know. Like you guys were saying, I don't want to lean back too far the other way and say, oh, I have to use my first round pick on a pitcher. And every season's player pool and ADP is different. You know, I mean, if things play out the way we think, and there's this huge tier from SP4 to 15, and, you know, you would have to use a second round pick on Yamamoto, who's the SP4, versus, I don't know, getting Chris Sale or let's say Hunter Green in round 4 or something like that. It's like, okay, you can wait if you think they're in a similar tier. So we'll see how ADP shakes out. I just think I need to be personally more cognizant of maybe getting what I consider to be an elite pitcher earlier on in drafts, whenever that might be. And ADP might determine that. So
can I give my second lesson, just because it will build off of this point?
I thought you already did, but go ahead.
No, personally, I referenced it. I need to do a better job of diversifying, especially on pitching, because what I noticed is a lot of the teams that went wrong had Gallen and Corbin Burns, or had George Kirby and Grayson Rodriguez. Those were more of the early drafts where we didn't know they were hurt yet. But what I realized, and this is less relevant for people who only draft one or two teams, but, you know, I'm playing 11 leagues. Maybe I shouldn't have one guy or a handful of guys in 6 of those leagues, you know? Like, maybe that's just, it introduces a lot of downside risk. It introduces some upside, right? Like, if Corbin Burns had stayed healthy and had a great season, things would look a lot different for me. But it is just to say that if you're playing in a bunch of different leagues and just talking about it as an analyst, there should be less certainty at the beginning of the season about outcomes, because every player has a wide range of outcomes. Some players, Paul Skeens' range of outcomes seems pretty slim at this point, but it's still, I don't know, if he finishes with a 2 ERA next year or a 3 ERA next year, would either outcome really surprise you that much? I guess I'd be a little surprised if Paul Skeens had a 3 ERA, but you know what I mean.
Well, just because he's a pitcher, there's downside risk that he suffers a horrible injury.
Well, sure, but I'm trying to just avoid that, because ultimately, to the injury discussion, the way I've always tried to think about it, and maybe I've failed a little bit, is every pitcher has like a 35% chance of suffering a serious injury.
Yes.
And maybe Jacob deGrom has a 60% chance of suffering a serious injury, and that is not nothing, but it's also nobody's safe, you know?
Just so we're not getting on this tangent, I was only saying that in reference to the lesson you learned. Like, if you drafted Paul Skeens as your first rounder in every league and then got hurt,
that's a bad decision.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's bad asset, man. This is I have like a mutual fund, I think. I don't know. I have a 401k. I have no idea what's going on with the stock market. But like, it is a bad idea to take 100% of your investment income and just throw it on one stock and say that one's going to be great. That's generally not a smart way to manage your money. It's the same in fantasy.
I think the way you should look at it, if you play in a lot of fantasy baseball leagues, diversifying early round picks and pitchers. Just because with early round picks, first and second round picks, they're all typically really good.
Yeah, there's not a big difference.
It can go wrong is if there's an injury or something like that, or just someone flat out busts. And you don't want to have that person on your team if things go wrong. And pitchers, just because of the volatility, right? Yep. So look, the mid to late rounds, if there's a pitcher that you have conviction about, I think it's okay to do that, because obviously like you can miss, and
the downside is you drop them, but you're probably dropping them anyway.
Top 5 or 6 round pitchers, you probably just want to diversify that as much as possible.
Okay, so my second lesson learned here kind of prevents me from, I think, having too many duplicates. Not that it's the primary thing, but accept obvious value, accept obvious value, even if you don't like the player. And this is kind of a point that I've been harping on throughout my whole career, but I feel like I've never quite put it in these terms. And also I feel like in more recent years, I kind of maybe got a little too confident in my abilities to assess players. And so I didn't take this so much to heart. I became a little bit too much about getting my guys, even if the price started to inflate on them, because I have a lot of influence and because the reason I like those guys, a lot of people, we've talked before about just how sharp all the fantasy pros have gotten. And it's really hard to get an edge when you're drafting, like an edge in terms of I can evaluate this guy better than you can, because everybody's looking at the same numbers. Nobody's method of evaluating is really that much more sophisticated than anybody else's. And so it's hard to get an edge that way. If you're just trying to outsmart people, it's hard to get an edge. Yeah. But I took, and I talked about it a little in the preseason. I took this approach a couple times. One example would be our podcast listeners league. I talked all offseason about how Jacob deGrom was the bust I felt most confident in, and I wasn't going to have any shares of him, but he fell like 4 rounds later than he should have gone. And I ended up taking him, and he had a great year. That is the sort of obvious value I'm talking about. If you're not going to get an edge by outsmarting people with your analytical ability, one way you can get an edge is just to take the obvious value. When everybody else is so smart that they think there's this guy, I know better than to take this guy, and he ends up falling multiple rounds, just take him. Because the truth is, we can all point to red flags that certain players had. We talked at the top of the show about one Cam Schlittler has. But the most likely scenario for any player is that he's going to be exactly who he showed he was. That is the most likely scenario for any player. And maybe that red flag will come to pass, but maybe it turns out to be a false flag. This seems to be the case more often. He was playing through injury. He just needed to develop this extra pitch. Like, players and teams know players know what's wrong with them, or their team knows what's wrong with them most of the time. And a lot of stuff is happening behind the scenes that we don't know about. And they'll probably just end up doing what they want. They won't happen. It won't always happen. There are busts, of course. But if everybody's busts are the same busts, that turns into a value play. And you just need to accept that value, because that is a potential edge at a time when it's really hard to get an edge in drafts.
Embrace uncertainty, I think, is another way to put that. Just don't be so certain in your valuation of a player that you can't see. Like, you should be kind of, to a certain extent, like player agnostic. That's obviously not to say that you shouldn't analyze players, but like, projection systems are really good. The wisdom of the crowds is really smart. If there's a guy who's fallen 25 picks past ADP, that's probably just a good pick. Like, their ADP's probably there for a reason.
I've seen this one go both ways. I totally hear what you're saying, Scott. When it's an obvious value, like getting to 4 rounds past ADP or something ridiculous like that. But I've had situations where I've been the person to take that player that kept falling, and then if it doesn't work out, you say, oh well, maybe 11 other drafters in the room all knew the same thing. Like, hey, let's stay away from this player.
Well, that's why I say obvious value. And of course, it's not always going to work out because nothing always works out. But in my experience of doing this, it's usually worked out. And you get a great value when it does. And yes, I am stressing, obviously. I'm not saying he goes a round later than ADP. Oh, I got to take him. It's only going to happen maybe 2 or 3 times a draft. But I'm saying you should, when you see it happening in a draft, regardless of your feelings for a player, again, the DeGrom example, I really hated him as an asset for this year in fantasy. But just take it because you don't know the future. And you could certainly imagine scenarios where it goes very right. It happened with the Brandon Nimmo thing is another good example. Everybody was avoiding him because of injury, and I was getting him in like round 15 of 15-team leagues, and that was just stupid value.
Yeah. There was one example where it worked out for me as well. Same exact thing. Chris Sale I had as a bust this season. He was going in round 2 of 15-team leagues, and the Great Fantasy Baseball Invitational draft that we did, I got him at the end of round 4 in a 15-team league. Like, I didn't want him, but he was the most obvious pick to take at that point. And I said, all right, well, let's hope I'm wrong about Chris Sale. And when he pitched, he was still really good this season. Next up for me, I have be careful with trading. And this one's interesting because I feel like trading doesn't happen as often in fantasy leagues. I've actually found myself trading more the past couple of years. I don't know why it's playing out that way, but there's no way around this. I made some really bad trades this season. Now, this could be a hindsight is 2020 thing. We didn't know Geraldo Perdomo was going to turn out to be a top 20 player in fantasy baseball, but there's an example. I traded Geraldo Perdomo back on April 28th in Tout Wars for Jonathan Aranda. I picked up Perdomo. I was using him at utility at the time, and I needed a corner infielder. I like Jonathan Aranda a lot. I thought, he was a sleeper / breakout type this year. And at the time, I was like, Perdomo's not going to keep this up. Again, it's, nobody knew that Perdomo was going to keep that up, even the person acquiring him. Another one here in NL only labor. I lost Thairo Estrada before the season, and so I kind of panicked. There's nothing on waivers in an NL only league. I wound up trading Michael Busch and Jason Adam for Nick Gonzalez and Blake Trinan. That was a terrible trade. Just it did not work out. Nick Gonzalez actually got hurt on opening day and missed 2 months, so that was another terrible part of that. But Michael Busch went on to have a huge season, which was even more impactful in NL only league. So I'm trying to figure out, is there something to take away from this, or did I just get 2 trades wrong? Because kind of like you said earlier, Chris, I don't want to try to find a lesson where there's not a lesson there to be found. But sometimes I find myself, the old adage in fantasy is sometimes the best trades you make are the ones that you don't, right?
I would say your Perdomo trade very early in the season, giving up Perdomo for Aranda. I mean, Perdomo to all of us seemed like a big overachiever. Yeah. Aranda, he was having a great year.
Awesome,
the only reason it didn't end up being a great year was because he got hurt. But it wouldn't have been as good as year as Perdomo ended up having, I think is fair to say. And so, yes, the result was bad. I don't think the process was bad there. So I want to beat yourself.
It could have been Michael Busch. To name or Yandy Diaz, to name just another kind of lower end starting first baseman or guys who are viewed as lower end starting first baseman.
The second trade you're talking about, what were the terms again?
So that was an NL only league. I lost Thairo Estrada. He was my starting second baseman before the season. So he got hurt in spring training. And so I had corner infield depth. I traded Michael Busch, basically Michael Busch for Nick Gonzalez. That was
And I remember you kind of float most of the time when you make a trade, you float it to us beforehand. And I was like, Frank, that's a bad trade. Don't do that. And so I don't know that it was wrong to make a trade. I just think it was a panic trade. It was it was
acting out of desperation, basically.
Yeah. And I think maybe the lesson there, there's no such thing as depth in an NL only league.
Yeah.
Trading, I've got depth. Well, no, you don't.
Yeah, I think I traded Michael Busch because I had Josh Bell and, wait for it, Jeimer Candelario. Didn't really have as much depth as I thought. So I would just say be careful with trading. Trading is fun. It's even more fun in dynasty and keeper leagues and stuff like that. But just be careful. Just don't make a trade for the sake of making a trade. All right. Let's go over to Chris for another lesson learned here.
Yeah, my last one, I think overlaps with one that you haven't mentioned yet. So we can just go ahead and talk about both if you want to. But mine is just be more open-minded about the unexpected. And the examples I would choose, I think Geraldo Perdomo is a great one where I'm fascinated to see where his price ends up this offseason because I think people are going to be way out on him in a way that they shouldn't be. But, Josh Naylor and Juan Soto's stolen bases, totally unexpected, but it happened. All the catcher breakouts and, the ongoing Pete Crow Armstrong discourse. I'm
going to say like a deeper discussion because we're talking about sleepers, breakouts, and busts on Thursday, but obviously you can mention it here.
Yeah. Just unexpected. There are, someone help me do them, 740 something players on a Major League Baseball roster at any given time, something like that. A lot of weird things are going to happen. There are 5,000 Major League Baseball games across the course of a full season. Like, weird things are going to happen constantly. When you're talking about individual players, you should never expect weird things to happen. You should never project weird things to happen for any given player. But for the player pool as a whole, you should be open to the possibility that some weird stuff is going to happen across the course of the season. God, didn't someone bad throw a no-hitter this year? Didn't we have one of those?
No hitters this year.
No no-hitters this year. Okay, that was right. But like that happens all the time.
Yeah.
Some scrub has a great month, and it's always like, how did this happen? It's like, weird things happen.
That's baseball season.
And so that's, I think for me, I should be more open-minded and less willing to just write off the potential that these unexpected things can continue. I think Geraldo Perdomo is a good example of that. I also think we should acknowledge that just because something happens for 4 months, Pete Crow Armstrong looking like the best player in baseball, doesn't necessarily mean that will hold forever and that our analysis does still matter. And so, I don't know. Obviously, look, if there was one weird trick to solving fantasy baseball, this job would be a lot easier and this podcast would be a lot less popular.
And probably the game would fold in on itself because nobody would be interested in it anymore.
Exactly. So that we're never going to solve this, but I think being a little more open-minded to the weird things that are happening, at least in the short term, probably wouldn't be a bad thing. Even if I think that's probably my biggest limitation as a fantasy player is that I stick to I think it's a strength as an analyst, but as a player, this guy's having a bad month. Yeah, but he's good. And it's like, but sometimes that bad month becomes 3 bad months, and all of a sudden it doesn't matter what he does 3 months later,
And I think the best application for this is in playing the waiver wire because your investment is, it gets a little different in fab leagues, I suppose, but your investment in a pickup is so minimal that it's like, why not? Let's see where it goes. And, a lot of times those players end up being instrumental. Like, it's too early. At the point, when the point comes where you have to pick them up, it's too early to know if it's legitimate. I mean, obviously we have real doubts about this guy. That's why he wasn't drafted. But that there are probably a couple dozen at least impactful players that emerge off the waiver wire every year. And so you just kind of have to, when you see a player ascending to new heights, you kind of just take the leap and figure out if it's legitimate later. And, the shallower the league, the more likely it is you can do that. But it is critical to putting together a winning team for sure.
I've seen Ben Gretsch of the Stealing Signals newsletter say this a few times for fantasy football, but I think it's relevant across. Is strong opinions weakly held. And I think that's a good way to view it, especially with those waiver wire guys, where like coming into the season, I didn't think Geraldo Perdomo was very good. Standing by that position and passing up on him on waivers was a disastrous mistake in any league. So you do need to be a little more open-minded than I am sometimes.
All right, Scott, bring us home with your final lesson.
Yeah, this is kind of related, actually. Regression doesn't follow a schedule. And it's not the first time I've had to learn this lesson. And I hate that I have to learn it again because I'm sure I even referenced it at points this season, specifically for that big PCA guy, Pete Crow Armstrong. Chris already talked about it. Looked like an MVP candidate for the first 4 months, was on like a 40-40 pace. Still ended up having a 30-30 season because 4 months is a long time. But the final 2 months were a disaster. 188 batting average, 533 OPS. And it's not to say that that's who Pete Crow Armstrong is either, just that there was a lot of reason to believe he was playing over his head for 4 months, and it eventually came home to roost. It happened to be after 4 months this time. It could have been after a month and a half. It could have been after 2 months. It could have happened for 4 months, and then he was amazing for the final 2.
It could have been April, May, August, September.
And then we don't even really notice it. Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's kind
he's
of what
not
happened
the
with
only
Tyler
example.
Soderstrom.
He's the most prominent example, but he's not the only one. Cedon Rafaela, who actually has a very, very remarkably similar profile. Their seasons happen to play out the same way, where they were great in the first half, terrible in the second half. And both of them have major plate discipline issues. And then, look at the opposite. Brian Reynolds, Brenton Doyle, Michael Harris. They were
terrible. Did you guys realize Christian Walker ended up with 27 homers and 88 RBI this year?
I do, because I mentioned him in my Things You Missed Once Fantasy Football Started article. Yeah, so he fits that mold too of regression happening in a positive direction in the second half. Like after half a season where they looked like they were totally useless, but it didn't make a lot of sense. And, the regression came. You don't know when it's going to happen. Often it happens early enough that we don't even it doesn't even affect their final stat line. But sometimes it doesn't. And so, kind of to contrast the point you were making, Chris, where if the fundamentals for a known quantity haven't changed, like the underlying characteristics haven't changed in a meaningful way, then they're probably going to get back to being that player. Yes. Like, you can bank on them getting back to being that player. You just can't bank on win. And we've seen players fake it for an entire season before, but that means you fade them the next season up to a degree.
A good example of this in action is this one stands out to me, Mitchell Parker. Remember, he had a 1.39 ERA through the first 5 starts of the season. There was nothing real about it. He had 20 strikeouts to 11 walks in his first 32 innings, and he capped it off with an 8-inning shutout against the Orioles, which at that time seemed like a big deal. And it's like, well, you got to we always say this, you got to just ride it until it falls apart. The problem is, his next start, he gives up 6 runs in 5 innings. And it's like, well, it's just one start. He still has a 2.65 ERA. Next start, 5 earned runs, 4 earned runs, 4 earned runs, 3 runs. It's one of those things where you can also, if you stick too close to those guys, the regression already came and you screwed up and you undid all the good because you probably didn't have Mitchell Parker in your lineup for most of the first 5 starts anyway. So it's like,
well,
that's
just
always
look at
tough too.
Gore this year. Not that there were reasons to buy into what Gore was doing, but
part of it is just the hot hand isn't that real.
Yeah. I mean, development is real. And so, sometimes in Mackenzie's Gore's case, I regret bringing him up because it looked like legitimate development in his case. It wasn't just a high hand play. But I guess the reason why I'm saying this is a lesson learned for me this year, even though I kind of knew it already, is because I regret kind of backing down on Crow Armstrong and just saying, yeah, I guess he's a first-round caliber player. I held out for 2.5 months. And you have to understand the pressure I was under for those 2.5 months.
My stubbornness paid off.
Yeah. People did not like to hear what I had to say about Pete Crow Armstrong. And I wish I could have just dug my heels in. I should have, obviously. But it gets to a point where you worry people aren't taking you seriously anymore. And to get back to my first lesson learned, or whichever lesson learned it was, I don't actually know the future, so maybe there's just something here I'm missing. 2.5 months, I guess it's long enough that I should just go with it. But it wasn't. I should have waited 4 months.
It's hard to remember in the moment that 2.5 months is really not very long in baseball.
That was the 60-game season. So think about it like that. When we were drafting Zach Plesac as a 5th or 6th round pick the following year, and Kenta Maeda and all that fun stuff. All right, we're going to wrap there for Scott, Chris. I am Frank. Thanks as always for tuning into Fantasy Baseball today. Please make sure to follow and leave a 5-star rating on Apple or Spotify. We will be back again Wednesday night / Thursday morning. Bye-bye.